The invisible man, the city of Indianapolis, had a way of swallowing sound once the clock crept past midnight. The traffic that normally roared through the streets slowed to a faint hum, and the glass towers that sparkled during the day dimmed into black silhouettes dotted with a few lonely lights. For Victoria Reynolds, CEO of Reynolds Financial Group, those late-night hours had become strangely comforting. While the rest of the world rested, she thrived in the silence of her corner office on the 21st floor, where the city looked more like a painting than a living place. Numbers, charts, emails, and contracts were her constant companions, and she wore her exhaustion like a badge of honor. To her, success meant being the last to leave and the first to arrive, a rhythm of discipline and ambition that few could match. Victoria had grown accustomed to seeing the cleaning crew slip in and out of the halls like ghosts. They came when most employees had long gone, their carts squeaking quietly against the polished floors, their presence as unobtrusive as shadows. They were invisible in the truest sense of the word, not out of cruelty, but because she had trained herself to overlook anything that wasn't part of her world of deals, deadlines, and board meetings. A janitor was a janitor. A person who came and went, unimportant to the grand machinery she commanded, or at least that was how she had always thought of them, until one night when her attention snagged on a man she would later wish she had noticed sooner. His name was Derek Coleman, though she did not know it at the time. To her, he was simply the janitor, a man in a gray uniform shirt, worn sneakers, and gloves that looked like they had scrubbed one too many restrooms. She noticed him because he moved differently than the others. He wasn't sloppy or careless. Every motion was deliberate, almost reverent, as though he respected the spaces he was hired to clean more than the executives who used them. Victoria had always assumed janitorial work was done mindlessly. Wipe, spray, empty trash, repeat. But Derek disproved that with every quiet step he took. That night, as she prepared to leave, she caught sight of him through the glass wall of the conference room. He wasn't cleaning at that moment. He stood leaning against his cart, his broad shoulders sagging under a weight that seemed heavier than his mop and bucket. In his hand he held a small photo, worn at the corners as though it had been carried for years. The expression on his face was not merely fatigue. Victoria had seen tired eyes in the mirror often enough to know the difference. His look carried something deeper, sorrow laced with tenderness, perhaps even hope tangled with grief. Before she could stop herself, she found her own steps slowing, her hand tightening on her briefcase handle as she strained to see what had captured his attention so completely. The photo was too far away to make out clearly, but she could tell it was of a child. A girl, perhaps. His thumb brushed the edge of the picture with a kind of gentleness that startled her. It was not the casual glance of a man looking at a wallet photo out of habit. It was the act of someone grounding himself, holding on to, a reminder of why he kept moving through long nights of scrubbing floors. Victoria should have dismissed it, turned away, and gone about her life. But for reasons she couldn't name, she didn't. The image of Derek standing there, just a janitor, invisible and unimportant in her world, remained etched in her mind, even as she rode the elevator down to the lobby. She found herself thinking about him as her driver whisked her through the city streets, past the glowing signs of restaurants and theaters, past people laughing and holding hands, their lives so distant from her own. Why had his look unsettled her? Why did it feel like there was a story in those tired eyes, one she had ignored for too long? The next night she noticed him again. He was polishing the long mahogany table in the boardroom, his movements steady and precise. She walked past, her heels clicking against the floor, but her eyes flicked sideways toward him. There it was again, the brief pause, the moment when he reached into his pocket and drew out that same photograph. She lingered in the hallway longer than necessary, pretending to scroll through her phone as she watched him stare at the picture with the same mixture of longing and quiet resolve. He slipped it away quickly when another janitor entered the room, resuming his work as though nothing had happened. Victoria tried to shake it off. She told herself she was imagining things, that she had no business concerning herself with the private life of a man whose job was to empty wastebaskets. Yet she couldn't. The mystery of Derek Coleman began to weave itself into her thoughts, distracting her from the spreadsheets glowing on her computer screen. It was ridiculous, she told herself, for a CEO of her stature to be so preoccupied with someone so far beneath her in the corporate hierarchy. But perhaps that was exactly why it gnawed at her, because deep down she knew she had lived her life believing people like him didn't matter. And now, against her will, she was beginning to question that belief. One night their paths crossed in the hallway. She had just finished a late call with overseas investors and was heading toward the elevators when she nearly collided with him. His cart was in the way and he quickly moved to the side, murmuring an apology. For the first time, she forced herself to pause. "Long night?" she asked, her tone clipped, sharper than she had intended. Derek straightened, meeting her eyes with a calmness that startled her. "Every night's long," he replied, his voice steady, unbothered. "But somebody's got to do it." There was no resentment in his words, no self-pity, just a simple statement of fact. He gave a nod, polite but not deferential, before turning back to his work. Victoria stood there for a moment longer, watching him adjust the trash bag, his shoulders hunched against the weight of labor few ever acknowledged. Something about his answer unsettled her. She was used to people tiptoeing around her, afraid of saying the wrong thing in front of the boss. Derek hadn't tried to impress her, hadn't seemed intimidated. He had spoken with a dignity that lingered in her mind long after she left. Over the next week, she began to notice him more often. Not just the way he cleaned, but the small habits that hinted at who he was beneath the uniform. He hummed softly when he worked, bits of melodies that sounded half-remembered like songs from another lifetime. He always paused before entering a room, scanning it carefully as though searching for something only he understood. And at precisely 1:15 a.m., she realized, he stopped by the vending machine in the lobby. Not to buy anything, he never put in coins or pressed a button. He simply sat for 5 minutes, his hands clasped loosely together, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then he would rise, roll his shoulders, and resume his duties as though those 5 minutes had never happened. Victoria told herself she didn't care, but her heart betrayed her, tugging her attention toward him again and again. What drove a man to work so quietly, so tirelessly, without complaint? Why did he look as though he carried an entire world on his back? Her curiosity grew until it tipped into action. One Thursday evening, after another long day of meetings, she lingered in her office deliberately, waiting for the moment Derek would leave. When she saw him finally roll his cart into the storage closet and clock out, she rose from her chair. Her driver was waiting downstairs, but instead of heading for the car, she followed Derek through the lobby. She kept her distance, her expensive heels muffled against the marble, her heart racing with a strange mix of anticipation and guilt. Derek walked out into the Indiana night, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his pace steady and unhurried. He passed the line of restaurants still buzzing with late-night diners, their laughter spilling onto the sidewalks, and turned toward quieter streets where the neon lights gave way to dim street lamps. Victoria trailed behind, clutching her coat tighter against the biting air. She felt foolish, a CEO trailing after her janitor like some amateur detective, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to know who he really was. And in that decision, in those quiet footsteps taken in the shadows of a city she thought she understood, Victoria Reynolds unknowingly stepped into a story that would change her forever. The hidden life. The streets of Indianapolis after midnight were not the same city Victoria knew by daylight. Gone were the polished suits, the clinking glasses in high-rise restaurants, and the parade of cars inching through downtown traffic. In their place stretched a quieter, rougher version of the city. Dimly lit sidewalks, shuttered storefronts, and the occasional figure hurrying home with shoulders hunched against the cold. Victoria had never walked these streets alone. Her life was chauffeur rides and secure parking garages, but now here she was, following a man whose very existence she would have ignored just weeks ago. Derek walked with the steady rhythm of someone used to long commutes on tired legs. His sneakers, worn at the soles, slapped softly against the pavement, his backpack swaying with each step. There was nothing remarkable about him to the casual eye, just another working man heading home after a late shift. But to Victoria, watching from a few paces back, everything about him felt layered with questions. Why did he carry himself with that quiet dignity? What was in that photograph he clutched when no one was watching? Why, with all his weariness, did his shoulders never fully slump in defeat? He didn't take the bus, though a stop was only a block away. Instead, he kept walking, turning into narrower streets where the city lights thinned. Victoria hesitated, her instinct telling her to stop, to call her driver and retreat to her warm car. Yet something inside her pushed her onward. She had spent her entire career studying numbers, projections, and trends, everything measurable and predictable. But Derek Coleman was not a number. He was a mystery, and for the first time in years, she found herself needing to understand a person rather than a profit margin. After nearly 20 minutes, Derek slowed near a modest brick building with chipped paint and flickering lights above the entrance. It wasn't the kind of apartment complex Victoria would ever set foot in willingly, but Derek climbed the steps with the ease of familiarity. She ducked behind a tree across the street, her breath visible in the cold air as she waited, half afraid he would turn around and catch her watching. A moment later, the door opened again. This time Derek emerged with a small figure tugging at his hand. It was a girl no older than 7 or 8, her hair pulled back in braids, her backpack nearly as large as her small frame. Even from across the street, Victoria could see the way the child's face lit up when she looked at Derek. Her smile was wide and genuine, a burst of sunshine in the dim night. Derek crouched down for a moment, brushing something from her cheek, and the tenderness in that gesture answered one of Victoria's questions instantly. This was the child in the photograph. A surge of understanding swept through her. Derek wasn't just a janitor working endless nights to make ends meet. He was a father, a single father, if the lack of another adult at that hour was any indication. Suddenly his exhaustion, his silence, his nightly ritual of staring at that photo, it all made sense. He wasn't working for himself. He was working for her, for the small girl now skipping beside him as if midnight were just another part of her world. Victoria's chest tightened in a way she didn't expect. In her world, children were raised by nannies and tucked into private schools with chauffeurs waiting at the curb. But here was Derek Coleman, walking his daughter home from what must have been a late-night babysitter or daycare, his own body carrying the weight of every sacrifice he made so that she could smile like that. The image shook Victoria more than she wanted to admit. She followed at a distance as Derek led the child up 3 flights of worn stairs and into an apartment where the curtains were thin enough to let slivers of light escape. She lingered on the sidewalk, her pulse quickening as she realized just how far she had strayed from her usual life. What was she doing, trailing a man into his private world? She had no answer, only the undeniable pull of curiosity and a strange, growing respect. From her vantage point, she could see Derek through the window. He moved around the small apartment with quiet efficiency, setting the girl's backpack on a chair, rinsing a cup in the sink and pulling out a carton of milk from a refrigerator that had seen better days. The girl talked animatedly, her hands waving as though she was recounting some story from her day. Derek smiled faintly, nodding at the right moments, his tiredness momentarily eclipsed by the simple joy of listening to her. Then came the part that rooted Victoria in place. Derek pulled a small notebook from the counter and set it in front of his daughter. She opened it eagerly and he leaned down beside her, guiding her pencil across the page. Homework. At 1 a.m. The little girl yawned but pressed on, her father's presence urging her forward. Victoria felt her throat tighten. She had employees in her company earning more in a week than Derek probably made in a month. And yet here he was, teaching his daughter at an hour when most children were asleep. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't efficient. But it was love, raw and unpolished, the kind that didn't need designer suits or boardrooms to prove itself. Victoria stayed longer than she should have, her breath fogging in the cold as she watched a man she had once dismissed reveal the quiet heroism of his life. She saw him tuck his daughter into bed with a kiss on the forehead, saw him linger at her bedside until her breathing slowed into sleep, and saw him finally sink into a chair at the table, his head dropping into his hands. For the first time, she noticed how deeply lined his face was, how weariness clung to him like a second skin, yet there was no bitterness, only the hollow silence of a man who carried burdens no one else saw. The longer she stood there, the more uncomfortable she felt. Not because of Derek, but because of herself. She had spent years building walls between herself and the people she deemed unimportant. She had walked past Derek in the office halls without so much as a glance, blind to the sacrifices he made after hours, and now that she had glimpsed his life, she could not unsee it. When she finally turned away, her driver was waiting at the curb where she had left him. He opened the car door without a word, accustomed to her late nights and sudden orders. Victoria slid into the leather seat, but instead of reaching for her phone or reviewing the next day's agenda, she stared out the window as the city slipped past. The lights blurred together, but her mind remained fixed on the image of a little girl with braids smiling up at her father, and of Derek Coleman, the janitor who was anything but invisible. As the car pulled into her gated driveway, Victoria realized something she had never felt before: envy. Not of Derek's exhaustion, of course, nor of his financial struggle, but of the unshakable bond she had witnessed between father and daughter, a bond forged not by wealth but by sacrifice. For all her millions, all her accolades, all her polished perfection, she wondered for the first time if perhaps she was the one who had been living in poverty. Not of money, but of meaning. That night, as she lay in her king-sized bed surrounded by silence, Victoria Reynolds could not sleep. She closed her eyes and saw Derek's worn sneakers by the door, his tired smile as he helped his daughter with her homework, his gentle kiss on her forehead, and she knew deep in her restless heart that she could never look at him, or at her own life, the same way again. Breaking the mask the next morning at the office, Victoria tried to bury herself in her usual rhythm: calls, meetings, reports, and the endless stream of decisions that shaped her empire. Yet no matter how many files she opened, no matter how many voices filled the boardroom, her mind drifted back to Derek Coleman. She saw his daughter's tired but eager eyes, her small hands gripping a pencil as her father guided her through late-night homework. She saw the flicker of warmth on Derek's face when she smiled at him, a warmth he never showed in the sterile halls of Reynolds Financial. The contrast unsettled her. How could someone live two such different lives, utterly invisible by day and yet carrying the weight of the world by night? In the office, Derek returned to his role like clockwork. He was silent, efficient, moving from room to room with his cart as though he were part of the building itself. Victoria found herself watching him more closely now, her gaze following his hands as he polished conference tables, the way he aligned chairs perfectly, the way he carried himself with a kind of pride that seemed out of place for the job he held. She noticed how he spoke little to his co-workers, but always acknowledged them with a nod or a faint smile, as though even in silence he recognized their shared struggles. Her curiosity gnawed at her until she could no longer keep her distance. One evening, as Derek was wiping down the glass wall outside her office, she opened her door and stepped out. "Mr. Coleman," she said, her voice carefully measured. Derek paused mid-motion, his cloth still in hand, and turned to face her. His expression was calm, polite, but unreadable. "Yes, ma'am?" he asked. Not with fear, not with flattery, but with the same steady tone he had used when he once told her that every night was long. Victoria hesitated, realizing she had no clear reason for calling out to him. She hadn't thought this through. I just wanted to thank you. The office is always immaculate. I know people don't say it often, but your work doesn't go unnoticed." For a moment, Derek studied her as though trying to decide whether she was sincere or simply indulging in some rare fit of politeness. Then he nodded once, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Thank you, Ms. Reynolds. Most people don't notice at all." His eyes lingered on hers for a brief second before he returned to his task, leaving Victoria standing in the hallway, strangely unsteady. It wasn't the words that shook her. It was the weight behind them. Most people don't notice at all. It was true, of course. She herself had walked past him countless times without a thought. But now, knowing what she knew, those words felt heavier than she was ready to admit. Over the next week, she found excuses to cross his path more often. Sometimes she asked how long his shift ran. Other times she commented on the weather or mentioned how late the nights had been. Derek always answered politely, never dismissive but never inviting deeper conversation either. It was as though he wore an invisible mask at work, one that kept his private world sealed away from curious eyes. Yet despite his guarded demeanor, Victoria began to see cracks in that mask. Once, as he passed by the break room, she heard him humming softly under his breath. The tune was faint but familiar, a lullaby her grandmother had once sung to her. She almost asked him about it, but by the time she gathered the courage, the sound had faded, swallowed by the squeak of his cartwheels, Another night, she saw him pause outside the lobby window, staring at the city lights with a look that was not longing, but determination, as if he were silently promising someone that he would not give up. Victoria's curiosity only grew, and with it her guilt. She had crossed into his personal world once by following him, and though she told herself she shouldn't repeat it, the memory of that little apartment, of that small girl with her oversized backpack, wouldn't let her rest. It wasn't enough to watch Derek at work. She needed to know who he truly was when the uniform came off. One evening, she waited until Derek clocked out and left the building. Instead of heading for her car, she followed him once again, this time with less hesitation. She knew the route now. The walk past late-night restaurants, the turn into quieter streets, the climb up the worn steps of his apartment. She kept her distance, careful not to draw attention, and when he disappeared inside, she stood across the street just as she had before. But that night brought a new discovery. After tucking his daughter into bed, Derek didn't collapse into his chair as he had the last time. Instead, he changed into a clean shirt, tucked something under his arm, and slipped back out into the night. Victoria's brows furrowed. Where could he possibly be going at this hour, after such a long shift? Without thinking, she followed. Derek walked several blocks to a low, weathered building with a faded sign that read, Community Outreach Center. Inside, the lights glowed warm, and as Derek stepped through the doors, Victoria crept to a window at the side. She peeked in and froze. There he was. Not a janitor, not a tired father, but a man standing in front of a small circle of other men, some his age, some younger, a few even older. He placed the bundle he carried, a stack of worn notebooks, on a table and began speaking. Though she couldn't hear every word, the expressions on the men's faces told the story. Respect, attention, trust. Derek was not cleaning here. He was leading. She caught snippets through the cracked window. Words about responsibility, about raising children, about not giving in to despair. He wasn't lecturing. He was sharing, his voice calm, steady, filled with the same quiet dignity she had heard in the office halls. One man wiped his eyes. Another leaned forward as if clinging to every syllable. Derek Coleman, the janitor she had once dismissed as invisible, was a mentor to men who clearly needed his strength. Victoria's breath caught. This was the second life he never revealed. The hours he poured into strangers, guiding them, encouraging them, helping them fight battles as silent and heavy as his own. He wasn't just a father to his daughter. He was a father figure to men who had lost their way. For a long time, she stood frozen in the shadows, her heart pounding with a mixture of awe and shame. She, the CEO with power and influence, had never once stepped into places like this, never used her wealth to lift up people who struggled in silence. Yet here was Derek with far less than she had, giving more of himself than she had ever dared to give. When the meeting ended and Derek emerged, locking the center's doors behind him, Victoria stepped back into the shadows. She didn't follow him this time. She didn't need to. She had seen enough to know that the man she had once thought unremarkable was, in truth, extraordinary. Walking back to her car, her heels clicking against the cracked pavement, Victoria felt something stir inside her. It wasn't pity and it wasn't mere curiosity anymore. It was the uncomfortable, undeniable realization that perhaps she had been living her life all wrong. The turning point, Victoria Reynolds had spent her entire career believing that success was measured in growth charts, quarterly profits, and stockholder satisfaction. She had built her empire on discipline and control, priding herself on her ability to stay untouchable, unaffected by the messiness of ordinary life. Yet in recent weeks, everything she thought she knew had begun to unravel. All it had taken was a janitor she had once walked past without notice. Derek Coleman had quietly dismantled her assumptions, not with words, but with the life he lived beyond the walls of her gleaming skyscraper. By day, he remained as invisible as ever. He polished floors, emptied trash bins, and moved through the hallways with steady silence. But now Victoria could no longer see him as she once had. Each time he passed her office door, she remembered the sight of him tucking his daughter into bed at 1 a.m. She remembered the way his voice steadied men at the community center, giving them courage when the world had given them none. She remembered his resilience, his quiet dignity, his refusal to complain despite carrying a burden most would collapse under, and she could not unsee any of it. Her admiration turned into something more complicated. a gnawing restlessness, a conviction that she could not simply remain a silent observer. It wasn't enough to follow Derek home, to stand in the shadows of his life and watch. She had the means to change things. She had power, influence, resources beyond imagining. For the first time, she asked herself what good they were if she never used them for anything other than her own ambition. The moment that broke her came unexpectedly. She was leaving the office late one evening, coat draped over her arm, when she heard laughter echoing faintly from the lobby. She paused at the mezzanine railing, looking down to see Derek's daughter waiting for him. It was unusual. Victoria had never seen the girl inside the building before. She was perched on one of the leather chairs, her legs swinging, a tattered book in her hands. When Derek emerged from the maintenance room, her whole face lit up. She sprang to her feet and ran to him, holding up the book as though it were a treasure. Derek crouched, listening intently as she babbled about a story she had read. Victoria's heart clenched at the sight. Here in the middle of a sterile corporate lobby, a father and daughter created their own world, one filled not with wealth, but with love so fierce it burned through exhaustion. It was in that moment that Victoria made her decision. She would not remain on the sidelines. She would act. The following week, she began quietly making arrangements. Through her connections, she ensured Derek's daughter received a scholarship to one of the better private schools in the city. She arranged for the tuition, the uniforms, the supplies, all paid anonymously, filed under a charitable foundation name that couldn't be traced back to her. It felt like the least she could do, a small attempt to ease the crushing weight she had watched Derek carry night after night. She imagined the relief he would feel when he realized his daughter's education was secured, that she would not have to grow up limited by the same struggles that defined his own life. But Derek's reaction was not the one she expected. 2 weeks later, she was leaving her office when she found him waiting for her by the elevators. He stood tall, his face calm but his eyes sharp with something she had never seen in him before. When the doors opened, he gestured for her to step aside. "We need to talk," he said simply. Victoria froze. She had not anticipated this. Her instinct was to retreat, to fall back on the cold professionalism that had protected her for years. But something in Derek's gaze stopped her. He wasn't angry exactly, but there was a firmness in him that demanded honesty. Wordlessly, she followed him into an empty conference room. "I know it was you," he began, his voice quiet but unwavering. "The scholarship, the school, the supplies." "Don't deny it." Victoria's lips parted, but no words came. She had gone to great lengths to keep her involvement hidden, and yet Derek had seen through it. She lowered her eyes, caught between embarrassment and defensiveness. "I only wanted to help," she said finally, her voice softer than she intended. Derek exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. For the first time, Victoria saw the strain etched deeply into his features, the fatigue of a man stretched thin by both pride and necessity. "I appreciate the thought," he said. "But my daughter doesn't need handouts. She needs a father who can show her that even if life knocks you down, you stand back up and fight. She needs to see that I can provide for her, that she doesn't have to depend on charity." The words cut deeper than any corporate critique ever had. Victoria opened her mouth to argue, to insist that she wasn't pitying him, but his voice grew steadier, more resolute. "You don't understand, Ms. Reynolds. You live in a world where money fixes everything. But in mine, integrity is all we have left. If I let someone else shoulder my responsibilities, what kind of example am I setting for her?" For a long moment, the room was silent. Victoria felt heat rising in her chest, not from anger, but from the sting of truth. She had thought her gesture was noble, but Derek's words revealed her blind spot. She had looked at him through the lens of wealth, assuming that because she had resources, she knew best. But Derek's pride was not arrogance. It was the backbone of his identity, the one thing he refused to surrender. Finally, Derek's tone softened, though his eyes remained firm. "If you really want to help, don't do it from the shadows. Don't try to fix things with money and expect me to just accept it. Respect me enough to ask what I need, to listen before you decide." Victoria swallowed hard. She had spent years surrounded by people who bent to her will, who never challenged her authority. Yet here was a janitor, a man with none of her power, telling her truths she had never heard before. For the first time in her career, she found herself humbled, not by failure in business, but by the unshakable strength of a man society dismissed as insignificant. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, the words foreign on her tongue. "I didn't mean to overstep." Derek studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you, just understand that my daughter doesn't need a savior. She needs her father, and I intend to be that no matter how hard it gets. Victoria left the conference room that night shaken to her core. She had offered what she thought was generosity, but Derek had shown her the difference between giving out of pity and giving out of respect. His words replayed in her mind as she rode the elevator down, echoing louder than any boardroom debate she had ever faced. That night, for the first time in years, Victoria cried, not out of weakness, but out of the realization that she had spent her life climbing to the top of a ladder that leaned against the wrong wall. She had wealth, status, recognition, yet here was Derek, a janitor with nothing by comparison, teaching her lessons that no amount of money could buy. The forever change, the days following her confrontation with Derek, left Victoria restless in a way she had never experienced. She was a woman who prided herself on control. Every project managed, every number balanced, every outcome calculated with precision. Yet Derek Coleman had unsettled her not with spreadsheets or strategies, but with words that pierced straight through the armor she had spent years building. Respect me enough to ask what I need. Don't decide for me. Those words rang in her ears long after he had spoken them, echoing in her penthouse at night and in her office by day. For the first time in her life, Victoria realized that she had lived behind glass, separate, untouchable, and most damning of all, disconnected. She had built a kingdom but never truly walked among its people. And now, when she thought of leadership, she could not separate the image of corner offices and polished boardrooms from the quiet dignity of a man who pushed a janitor's cart with more integrity than most CEOs wielded in a boardroom. Her change began slowly. She didn't storm into meetings with grand declarations or announce sweeping reforms. Instead, she started with the small things, the things that Derek had taught her mattered. She began greeting every member of her staff, executives, assistants, custodians, receptionists, with the same genuine acknowledgement. She listened more in meetings, asking not just for updates but for perspectives. And when one of her managers mentioned an employee struggling with childcare, she didn't dismiss it as a personal problem. Instead, she initiated a quiet review of the company's policies, looking for ways to support working parents. But her most profound transformation happened not in the office, but in the choices she made outside of it. One Friday evening, when most of her colleagues were preparing for a weekend of leisure, Victoria found herself driving to the small brick community center, where Derek spent his nights guiding men who had nowhere else to turn. She sat in her car for several minutes staring at the weathered sign, questioning what she was doing. This was not her world. Yet something inside her urged her forward. When she finally stepped inside, the conversations hushed for a moment. A few men glanced her way, their expressions cautious, some even suspicious. She knew what they saw: a polished woman in a tailored coat, heels too fine for the cracked floor beneath her. But then Derek appeared at the front of the room, his expression flickering with surprise. He didn't rush to greet her, didn't shield her from the curious stares. Instead, he simply nodded once as if to say, "If you're here, you're welcome, but you'll need to earn your place." Victoria sat quietly in the circle, listening as Derek guided the men through another evening of conversation. He spoke about fatherhood, about perseverance, about the dignity of hard work even when no one noticed. She didn't speak, not that first night. She simply absorbed, humbled by the way these men shared pieces of themselves she had never heard spoken in her own circles. Fear, regret, hope, and above all, determination to be better than the world expected of them. Over time, Victoria became a regular presence. She didn't try to lead. She didn't try to impose solutions. She listened. She asked questions. And when trust finally grew, she began quietly offering resources, not as charity but as partnership. She connected men to job training programs, arranged transportation vouchers, and leveraged her network to secure second chances for those who needed them most. She was no longer the CEO looking down from a glass tower. She was a woman learning to stand shoulder to shoulder with people she once overlooked. Through it all, Derek remained steady. He never flattered her, never allowed her wealth or influence to overshadow the real work being done. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen between them. It wasn't romance, not yet, and perhaps not ever, but it was something deeper. Respect forged in truth. For the first time in her life, Victoria felt seen not for her title, not for her power, but for her willingness to learn, to change, to walk into spaces where she had once feared to go. Years later, the proof of that change became most visible in the glow of a crowded high school gymnasium. The bleachers were filled with cheering families, balloons bobbing in the air, and proud parents craning for a glimpse of their children in caps and gowns. Victoria sat in the middle of the crowd, not in a VIP section, not in a private box, but among ordinary families who laughed and clapped with unrestrained joy. Beside her sat Derek, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes shining as he watched his daughter walk across the stage to receive her diploma. Victoria's chest tightened as the girl turned, smiling wider than she ever had, her braids swinging as she held up her diploma for her father to see. Derek's applause thundered louder than anyone's, and Victoria found herself clapping just as fiercely, tears pricking at her eyes. She had seen this child years ago, trudging through the night with an oversized backpack, sitting at a kitchen table past midnight doing homework while her father fought to stay awake. And now here she was, stepping into a future built not on privilege, but on love, sacrifice, and unyielding determination. As the ceremony ended and families spilled into the aisles, Derek turned to Victoria. His voice was quiet, thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without her," he said, nodding toward his daughter. "And I couldn't have done it without learning that sometimes strength isn't about doing everything alone. Sometimes it's about letting the right people stand with you." Victoria swallowed hard, her throat tight. She thought of the woman she had once been, cold, untouchable, measuring her worth in stock prices and accolades. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone who had discovered that the greatest success was not in power, but in people. Not in climbing higher, but in reaching lower to lift others with you. That night, as they walked out of the gymnasium into the summer air, Derek's daughter bounded ahead, laughing with her friends. Derek and Victoria walked side by side, no longer CEO and janitor, no longer separated by class or title, but simply two people bound by a shared understanding of what it truly meant to live with purpose. Victoria looked up at the stars scattered across the Indiana sky, her heart strangely light. She had once thought she knew everything about success. But it turned out success was not the corner office or the empire she had built. It was the lives she touched, the moments of kindness that rippled outward, the courage to see people not as invisible, but as extraordinary. And she knew as long as she carried that lesson, she would never go back to the woman she once was.